headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, the Bloomberg Business app, and at Bloomberg Quick Take. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
From Bloomberg World headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. Developing story, more companies suspending ties with Russia. Gap, the retailer based in San Francisco, Gap moments ago saying it is suspending deliveries to Russia. The Walt Disney Company is taking steps to pause its businesses in Russia. It says that pause does include Disney Cruise Line activities. Walt Disney Company shares lower today by 0.1%. We've got Gap down now by just about 1.5%. Stocks lower across the board, with the Dow, the S&P, and NASDAQ all declining. Treasury yields are pushing higher after inflation accelerated for a sixth successive month, and the Russian attack on Ukraine shows no sign of letting up. Right now, the S&P down 26, off session lows, down 0.6%. The Dow is down 177, down now by 0.5%. NASDAQ down 146, a drop right now of 1.1%. 10-year yield 2.00%. We've got spot gold up 0.2%, $19.95 the ounce. West Texas Intermediate crude oil tumbling 2.2%, $106.33 a barrel. Bitcoin right now tumbling 6.3%, $39,265 on Bitcoin. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
Thank you so much for that update, Charlie Pellet.
All right, as Charlie just mentioned, the headlines crossing Gap suspending deliveries to Russia and moving deliveries to ports, southern and eastern ports specifically. And then you've got Disney taking steps to pause businesses in Russia, and that includes content and product licensing, and it also includes Disney Cruise Line activities. And then you have, Tim, our most read story on the Bloomberg, and this has to do with the Wall Street banks.
Goldman Sachs is who we're specifically talking about, and it's an exclusive from Sri Natarajan. Sally Bakewell is finance team leader for Bloomberg News. She's with us in the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. Sally, you edited this story from Sri. Talk to us a little bit about the significance of actually Goldman exiting Russia, and what are the details with an exit? Is this like done with Russia indefinitely, or bring us into it?
I think it does seem like it is done with Russia indefinitely. I don't think we can say that for absolute certain, because that is quite a big step to permanently pull out of a country.
That's massive.
It is massive, although to note, Citi has itself done that. It was in Russia, or it pulled out of Russia, it went back. Right now, that bank is assessing whether it stays in Russia or not. So I think it is very significant that Goldman Sachs has done this, because actually no European banks have exited the country. They're all assessing their exposure, but they haven't actually made that step yet.
How much exposure do these guys have to Russia? And how much business do they really get in Russia?
So Wall Street banks have sort of emphasized that actually their exposure is quite small. I think the Goldman Sachs story said that they have about 650 million of exposure there. Citi is the largest one. It has a very substantial presence with about 3,000 workers. And if you recall, Citi, which is trying to sell its retail operations, Russia is included in some of those. So that sale has obviously been a bit stalled by the situation in the country.
Sally, we just talked a little bit about the idea that Russia could start to move in and nationalize foreign firms. And I'm wondering about this decision. If it's a decision about, okay, well, we don't want to operate a bank in a place that, is doing something we disagree with, like because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, or is it also about business risk? I'm not just talking customers, but I'm talking like, oh, wait a second, Russia could come in and actually seize this bank.
Right. I think that's probably a question that they are all debating right now. What is interesting that I think some of the banks are actually involved in the companies who are suspending operations and pulling out of the country. They're actually helping with that. So it is a sort of business stream for them as it is already. But I think that does complicate matters. I mean, they have to deal with the tremendously complicated SWIFT situation and those transactions that they might have to block, and whether some of the transactions have less obvious sanctioned Russian entities involved in them, and then they have the sanctions too, and then now they're weighing exposure.
When you say SWIFT, you're referring to the global platform
Yes.
for messaging that banks use to communicate with one another that
Yes.
Russia was suspended from.
That
Exactly.
Jamie Dimon said there are ways to get around, although that they
Yes.
aren't.
Right.
Not that JP Morgan is.
Exactly.
Help me out here, because, and forgive me for being the cynic, I'm an optimist usually, and I think good of people and entities, but what's interesting is It's not the first time we've seen the financial sector kind of back away from a troubled area of our world, only to get back in because there's money to be made. Is that ultimately, I mean, right now there's sanctions, right? There's rules when there are sanctions implied against a certain area of the world. How do we think about that relationship, right? That global banks, Wall Street banks specifically, have with areas of the world. If there's money to be made, they will go there.
I think Citi might again be
or
an
not.
example
Correct me.
of that.
Yeah.
No, I think Citi is an example of that, maybe in the sense that it was in Russia and it came out, it went back in again. I suspect that memories become a little bit shorter when there is money on the table. Obviously the degree of severity of the responses from everyone, from all corporations and from some banks that we're starting to see now, do indicate perhaps a slight shift in philosophy about something like this.
Right.
But I guess time will tell as to whether it becomes a permanent sort of frame of mind about the Russia-Ukraine situation.
So, Sally, is this the first of every major bank to pull out?
I
Is that
think
your
it's
prediction?
going to look, this is the first, and I think it's going to look pretty strange if others don't follow from now. So, we're chasing hard to see if we can pin down similar decisions. I think every bank now has to be looking at this and assessing whether it's a question of winding down some of the business but keeping something there, or wholesale pulling out.
I always think about you guys. I mean, you're a finance team leader. I can only imagine the discussions you guys are having around the desks or on virtual meetings as you look at this, globally and certainly from the Wall Street banks. What are some of the issues you're thinking about as we continue to watch a situation that we, fingers crossed, had hoped would never happen, did happen, hoped it would wrap up soon, and now we're entering our third week here or so? So I'm just curious, what are the discussions you guys have been having?
Well, a lot comes down to exposure. As I said at the beginning, a lot of the banks have said that their exposure is quite small, but as time goes on, maybe they start to realize they have more than they thought through various complicated financial instruments and so on. So we're thinking about that. Just the very sort of physicality of what they have to do to move people out. We had a great story today by Jenny Serrain about Visa. The CEO gave this quite harrowing account of how they evacuated their staff from Ukraine, and they had to use mercenaries. The CEO got a text while he was in church from President Zelensky asking for help, and of course Visa suspended its business there. So I think it's sort of a question of exposure, business, direct or indirect business, how complicated it is to wind that down, and then the actual physical presence.
It is tough. Thank you so much. Sally Bakewell, she is, of course, finance team leader at Bloomberg News.
Broadcasting live from the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers Studio in New York. Bloomberg 1130 to Washington, D.C. Bloomberg 99.1 to Boston. Bloomberg 106.1 to San Francisco. Bloomberg 960 to the country. Sirius XM Channel 119. And around the globe, the Bloomberg Business app and BloombergRadio.com. This is Bloomberg Business Week.
Yes, indeed. You are listening to Bloomberg Business Week. Carol Master along with Tim Stenovec. Coming up, we're going to just get to the latest when it comes to COVID and specifically watching what's going on in Ukraine. There's obviously the war there, but they too are in the midst of this pandemic.
Yeah, just because of a lower vaccination rate in the country of Ukraine and more than 2 million people, according to the UN, fleeing Ukraine to neighboring countries. What does that mean for the spread of COVID to other places as well? We're going to talk about that in a few minutes. First, though, a check of the trading day. Here's Charlie Pellet.
Thank you very much, and here's what's going on. We're well off session lows with the Dow, the S&P, and NASDAQ all declining right now. Stocks fell. Treasury yields are pushing higher after inflation accelerated for a 6th successive month, and the Russian attack on Ukraine shows no sign of letting up. Right now, the S&P is down 22 points, down 0.5. The Dow down 163, down 0.5. NASDAQ lower by 126, down by 1%. Key takeaway here, we are well off our session lows. 10-year yield 1.99%. We've got spot gold up 0.2%, $19.95 the ounce, while West Texas Intermediate crude is declining 2.4%, 106.01 right now for a barrel of WTI. Disney says it's taking steps to pause all businesses in Russia, including content and product licensing, Disney Cruise Line activities, National Geographic magazine, and tours, local content productions, and linear channels. Goldman Sachs Group became the first major Wall Street bank to announce plans to close its operations in Russia, joining an exodus of companies that also include the automaker Stellantis. Stellantis shares, by the way, trading lower right now by 6.4%. For businesses across the globe, the war in Ukraine and higher commodity prices have corporations asking big questions about their supply chains. Katrina Dudley is investment strategist at Franklin Mutual Advisors.
We're talking to so many CEOs that are really focusing on their supply chain resilience. And the resilience of that supply chains is going to now involve country risk assessment and understanding, which countries you have your supply and those critical supplies located, and looking to see that you can diversify.
And today we've got Gap suspending deliveries to Russia. Google Cloud will also stop accepting new customers in Russia, according to the Insider. This headline from the Bloomberg Professional Service: Tiger Global raising $1 billion of private debt through J.P. Morgan. General Electric reiterating its 2022 financial targets. GE shares now down by 0.6%. Amazon announcing that 20-for-1 stock split. Amazon shares up today by 6.2%. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. You are listening to Bloomberg Business Week. Carol Master along with Tim Stenovec. And just want to mention, did Charlie mention eBay also? They just came out with some of their, forgive me, the headlines are coming fast and furious, talking about their forecast for 2023, adjusted EPS growth of about 10%, 2024 growth of about 15%. The stock right now is a little bit lower in today's trade, and just wanted to quick bring it up. It was up as much as 4.5% earlier, still down about 1% in the trade.
Carol, as you mentioned, a conversation that has been lost, I think, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine is what the COVID situation has been.
Yep.
And we're fortunate to be joined by Rupali Lemay, Associate Scientist in the Department of International Health at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, who joins us now on the phone from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Dr. Lemay, it's good to have you back with us. How are you?
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be back.
Well, let's talk a little bit about what your focus has been over these last couple of weeks, because we've been talking, of course, a lot about the global economic effects of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But I think partly lost in that conversation has been what it means for the spread of COVID, especially as you see more than 2 million refugees flee Ukraine. What have you been focusing on over the past couple of weeks?
Yeah, no, I think you hit it right on the head. There's 2 million refugees that we know of. That number is likely higher than that. And I think the biggest issue that we're seeing is that we do know that conflict and infectious disease go hand in hand. So the concern really here is how do we make sure that as individuals are moving to different cities, to different locations, to different countries, that we're doing all that we can to protect them from COVID. Previous to the invasion, I think the rates for primary dose series completion in Ukraine were not great. So we were already dealing with a large proportion of the population that had not been vaccinated. And so this has really just been exacerbated. And then you add on this issue of not being able to get health supplies in. So it's just a really dire situation.
Yeah, no, dire situation on so many different levels. When anything to do right now with Ukraine, we think about, obviously we talk about so many different impacts on markets, of course, and what businesses are doing. But of course, it's a humanitarian story that we are all following so closely. Rupali, I also think it's just a reminder. It's hard right now, I'm going to be very honest with you, to remember that I'm in a pandemic. We all are still in a pandemic because of what's going on in the world right now. But, I am curious, you guys, what will ultimately determine that we are beyond the pandemic stage as a world and moving to the endemic stage?
It's a really good question. And I think in parts of the United States, I think folks are already there. A lot of states are repealing their mask mandates, for example.
Right.
Here in the United States, we still have almost 40% of the population, of the adult population, that has not gotten vaccinated. So it's a little bit concerning when you're seeing states doing that, when you're also seeing an increase in perhaps a new sort of subvariant that's starting to rise. And so I think part of it, to me, no deaths are really acceptable. I think people think about this and say, you know what, only 44 children have died from COVID. I think that number should be 0.
Yeah,
I think other
agreed.
individuals would say, well, it's time for us to, quote unquote, get back to normal. Well, we have to do that in a way that's equitable, but that also allows for protections if we need them, which, again, a mask is one of the easiest mitigation measures that we really have and we should employ, but many states are repealing that right now.
What's a realistic way for us to think about how the pandemic actually ends? Carol asked about it becoming an endemic, but I think so much of the way of our sentiment has to do with expectations. So help set expectations for us.
Yeah, I think the most realistic way is that if we can make sure and think about community transmission and gets under a specific level, a threshold level, we do know it's going to be with us, so it's not something that we can eliminate. It's here to stay. I think the key here is how do we essentially protect individuals that are immunocompromised or are at risk for severe COVID. And so part of that has to do is we really need to make sure that community transmission rates are very low. That requires a bit of a nuanced approach. And what I mean by that is if you live in a particular area and rates are starting to increase again, then we need to be able to implement mitigation strategies again. So that can be essentially bringing the mask mandates back, ensuring that there's ventilation in schools, et cetera, and so forth. I'm hopeful because we're going into the warmer months that more people tend to be outside. There tends to be better ventilation.
Right.
So we hopefully will see some good downward trends. But I think the question is going to be what happens in the fall when it starts to get cold again. We start to see other infectious pathogens like RSV, right, and influenza start to circulate again. And so I think a more realistic pathway is going to be, we do know it's here to stay.
Right.
It will be a bit, in my opinion, of easing of these measures, but we also need to be prepared that some of these measures might be implemented again, depending on transmission.
Rupali, yes or no? Are we going to need to get another booster?
Oh, goodness, that's a hard one. We do know that immunity wanes.
Okay.
So I think part of it will depend on how much transmission is occurring and how many people actually have immunity.
All right.
So I think kind of not known yet.
Okay, that's fair. Rupali LeMay, she's Associate Scientist in the Department of International Health at Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, of course, supported by Michael R. Bloomberg, founder of Bloomberg LP and Bloomberg Philanthropies.
Well, let's go to Washington, D.C. for a check of the latest world and national news with Nancy Lyons. Hey, Nance.
Hey, Tim. Russia and Ukraine held their highest level talks today, but Ukraine's Foreign Affairs Minister Dmytro Kuleba says there was no agreement on a ceasefire.
We did not make progress on this since it seems that there are other decision makers for this matter in Russia.
Dmytro Kuleba says Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said they will continue their aggression until Ukraine meets their demands, which include surrender. Lavrov says after the meeting that Russia wants the demilitarization of Ukraine. Well, there's another tension point between the U.S. and Russia. Bloomberg's Nathan Hager has the latest developments in the information war.
The White House is blasting Russia and China for promoting a conspiracy theory that the U.S. military runs biological and chemical weapons labs in Ukraine. In a statement, Press Secretary Jen Psaki called the claims preposterous and the kind of disinformation they've seen repeatedly from the Russians over the years. Psaki also raised concerns Russia could use chemical weapons in Ukraine. At a Senate hearing this week, Undersecretary of State Victoria Nuland said the U.S. is working with Ukraine to keep materials from its biological labs out of Russian hands. In Washington, I'm Nathan Hager, Bloomberg Radio.
The Biden administration is extending the mask-wearing requirement on planes, trains, and other transit for another month. The Transportation Security Administration says the mandate that was set to expire March 18th will now be extended to April 18th. Global news 24 hours a day, on air and on Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Nancy Lyons.
All right, Nance, thank you so much. Carol Masser, Tim Stanovic, and our thanks, of course, to Nancy Lyons with an update. A lot going on, and if I look at the most read on the Bloomberg in the past 8 hours, a lot of stories that we've been trying to bring to your attention. We mentioned Goldman Sachs exiting Russia in Wall Street's first pullout. We talked about that with Sally Bakewell, but there's also a story about Leon Black and a face-off he's having with an ex-model who I believe was also a girlfriend?
Let's just go right to the text. Lawyers for the billionaire Leon Black and a former model he says is trying to destroy his reputation see little chance of settling her claims that he defamed and sexually assaulted her. U.S. District Judge asked the 7 lawyers present in a New York courtroom Thursday about the prospects for the settlement, saying, quote, raise your hand if anyone would give an answer other than slim to none. No hands were raised.
Yeah, and I guess I said girlfriend with a question mark,
Yeah.
because I think that's an issue about kind
Exactly.
of what was ultimately the relationship. And so Black, of course, the co-founder of Apollo Global Management, suing Giselle Geneva and her lawyers, Wigdor LLP, last year after she sued him for defamation, intentional infliction of emotional distress, gender-motivated violence, and retaliation. Black claims Geneva, Apollo co-founder Josh Harris, and Apollo's outside PR advisor violated civil racketeering laws by conspiring to destroy him personally and professionally. And Black claims the Wigdor firm spread false information about him. This one's complicated.
Harris, we should note, has denied the claims. Black's lawyer, Susan Estrich, filed a letter with the federal judge overseeing Black's case Wednesday, claiming her team had received WhatsApp messages between Ganieva and a New York Times reporter showing she was working with her lawyer, Douglas Wigdor, months before Ganieva officially retained him.
All right, so a lot of back and forth between these two in terms of legal claims. We know Leon Black has stepped down as chairman and CEO of Apollo and receded from roles including chairman of New York's Museum of Modern Art. And Ganieva's initial allegations of sexual assault, first revealed in tweets in mid-March of last year, followed some reports of some payments that Mr. Black made. Anyway, complicated, lots of pieces. Go to Bloomberg.com for more.
sports, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day at Bloomberg.com, the Bloomberg Business app, and at Bloomberg Quick Take. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
From Bloomberg World Headquarters, I'm Charlie Pellet. We begin with a developing story and a headline from the Bloomberg Professional Service. J.P. Morgan says it is, quote, actively unwinding its Russia business. Again, J.P. Morgan unwinding its business in Russia. J.P. Morgan Chase shares lower now by 1.4%. Stocks fell. Treasury yields pushed higher after inflation accelerated for a sixth consecutive month. The Russian attack on Ukraine showing no sign of letting up today, with the S&P now lower by 23 points, down 0.5%. The Dow's down 161, down 0.5. Nasdaq down 128, a drop of 1%. 10-year is down 15.30 seconds. 10-year yield 2.00%. Spot gold up 0.2% right now, 19.95 the ounce. West Texas Intermediate crude down 2.3%, 106.19 a barrel. After earnings, CrowdStrike shares, cybersecurity company, rallying 13.7%, and reporting after the closing bell today will be Rivian Automotive. Its shares down now by 6.2%. I'm Charlie Pellet. That is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
All right, Charlie, thank you so much. Well, the new issue of Bloomberg Business Week, it is out. In it, a story by Bloomberg's Olivia Carville, who you might remember reported out a revealing BW cover story that was last summer about Airbnb's handling of violent crimes at its listings. Well, this week, she looks at sexual abuse in the world of show jumping and the efforts to impede Safe Sport, which was an organization set up to help young athletes victimized by misconduct.
Olivia Carville is investigative reporter for Bloomberg News. She's with us in the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. Joel Weber is editor at Bloomberg Business Week. He's also with us in the Bloomberg Interactive Brokers studio. Olivia's story featured in the new issue of Business Week magazine, available on newsstands, on the Bloomberg, and at Bloomberg.com/businessweek. Joel, this is a powerful story. It's one about an institution and one about an institution being set up to try to help that institution. There are a lot of familiar threads here.
Yeah, it's a rarefied world. The sport that we're talking about here is equestrian. It's an Olympic sport. Olivia's Carville's reporting on this has just been an amazing one. Was really just honored to publish it in the magazine and also talk about it today, because ultimately a lot of this legacy of what she writes about in this story actually goes back to Larry Nassar and what happened in the gymnastics world. And there have been many things that have changed since that moment a couple years ago. One being this organization, Safe Sport, that was founded by U.S. Congress to basically help police sex abuse and protect young athletes. But what's happened and what Olivia's reporting revealed is that there's sort of one community that has resisted any sense of discussion about this and has not liked watching its heroes fall. So Olivia, bring us into the story and what happened at the stables.
Yeah, sure. And thanks so much for having me on. This was a really important story from my perspective as well, just to be able to tell these young riders stories, to hear it in their own words, what happened to them, what does grooming look like to them, and why their community was in a sense actually attacking them in some cases. I think within equestrian we have seen a really elite sport be torn apart by Safe Sport, be torn apart by its history, and here you've actually got some pretty wealthy individuals who have spent their life with coming out and attacking Safe Sport, this watchdog agency, and also questioning the antics of some of these survivors, which has been really sad to see.
I'm kind of shocked that this hasn't come out sooner. Again, it's like, was once again a situation of the institution protecting itself?
Yeah, that's right. I think if you look back in Olympic sporting communities, there has been a history of prominent figures who have been accused of sexual misconduct being covered up by the national governing bodies. And we've certainly seen that within equestrian. Some of the most prominent figures that we mention in this piece had complaints about sexual misconduct raised against them, but it had never really resulted in them being banned at all. And yet, with the creation of Safe Sport, we're seeing some of these individuals finally being held accountable, and the sport doesn't like that.
Olivia, the piece is filled with powerful but harrowing anecdotes and stories about people who were affected, but also some really startling statistics. Through the end of 2021, 47 of the 1,275 sanctions that the center had handed down and publicized, we're talking Safe Sport here, in its disciplinary database had been against members of the U.S. Equestrian Federation. By comparison, members of the USTA, the U.S. Tennis Association, it's 8 times as big, have only received 35 Safe Sport sanctions. What's going on with equestrian?
Yeah, I think we're seeing a bigger number of equestrians sanctioned by Safe Sport than other sports, and that is causing a pushback from within the sport as well. I think that this is a sport that has historically been very insular, very exclusive. They don't like to let outsiders in. It was quite a challenging story to write because it's hard to break into this community. And so when they started to be sanctioned from historic cases going back to the 1970s, 1980s, the sport started to fight against that. It's a sporting community that doesn't like being told what to do and is willing to push back and challenge those in power when it doesn't believe they're getting it right.
So Jerice Colon was appointed Chief Executive Officer of Safe Sport, had a background where she previously had worked at the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. What was her experience coming in to Safe Sport and taking over the reins of the organization?
Yeah, Jerice was a pretty incredible interview, actually. She was shocked when she came in and started running Safe Sport. She had been working in child safety before, but she had never experienced so much animosity, so much hostility, so much anger, because when you're working within child safety at the elite sporting level, these are people who want their children to win. There is a sense of, desire to win, but also ambition. This is particularly equestrian. It's a community of very rich and very powerful individuals, and they did push back against Jerice, and she actually mentioned to me in her interview how on her first week on the job, she received a call from the mother of a young rider who wanted her daughter's trainer to be reinstated. He'd been removed for sexual misconduct, and she wanted him back in the job because she wanted her child to win. And that's something that Jerice had never really experienced before in any of her previous roles in this area.
And let's kind of talk about who she's had to struggle with, the critics, the people who are critical of Safe Sport. What's the rationale? What are they objecting to?
And just unfortunately have about 20 seconds, 25.
Yeah, sure. The critics are saying Safe Sport lacks transparency, it lacks due process. They believe that it is unconstitutional in the US to have an organization set up that is labeling people guilty before proven innocent. And they're coming after Jerice and they're coming after Safe Sport for that reason.
I'm just going to say a most read, a Bloomberg Big Take, a must read, and it's in the new issue of Bloomberg Business Week magazine. Unbelievable. Olivia, thank you so much. Olivia Carville, investigative reporter at Bloomberg News, and of course our thanks to Jill Weber, editor of the magazine.
March is Women's History Month, and every day this month we are celebrating significant moments in women's history. Now with your installment for Thursday, March 10th, here's Bloomberg's Renita Young.
On this day in women's history in 2015, Los Angeles celebrates Susan Ann Cuddy Day. She's the first Asian American woman to join the U.S. Navy and its first female gunnery officer. Cuddy rose to the rank of lieutenant. She later worked for U.S. Naval Intelligence, the Library of Congress, and the National Security Agency. Cuddy is also the daughter of the first married Korean couple to immigrate to the U.S. She served during World War II. During the first celebration of Susan Ann Cuddy Day, she was 100 years old. She said when the war came, she was motivated to fight for freedom, and it didn't matter whether she was Asian or not. During her service, Cuddy had to endure segregation and racism and had to marry her Irish-American husband on a naval base because interracial marriages were against the law at the time in Virginia. That's Today in Women's History. I'm Renita Young, Bloomberg Radio.
A big thank you to Bloomberg's Renita Young. This is Bloomberg.